Well, let's get started. Good morning. Good morning, Rob Martin and Harry Ward and Sandy and some others I know who are brave enough to stick with me with this story. I'm going to tell you today that it's almost like the centerpiece of the story. I think I mentioned sometime in the past in one of these that the story wasn't about Middletown. And it wasn't about Mac, actually. It wasn't even on this same planet. Well, in this story, one of the last ones, we got introduced to a woman named Cheyenne. I love that name. It's really cool. Well, Cheyenne turned out to not be what she seemed. And one of the players at the farm volunteered to go on a one-way trip to the Centauri system. His name was Mark. His wife's name was Gracie. A very emotional part of the story. Well, Cheyenne turned to me and said, Mac, your part is this. She said that the scientist on Prime who had developed all this technology, all this science of translation to the different Earth timelines, they had all this science, but they had never developed any kind of science that would enable them to go to a different star system. It was out of reach. They were able to go from Prime to the moon and to Mars and to Europa. But no farther. And it was a problem. So Prime initiated a very, very long time, hundreds of centuries, it seemed like, a long-term project to see what they could do about the problem. Well, they had developed a way to use the translation system to sort of look ahead in the timeline to identify people who in their lives were looking for the solution to this problem of being able to travel to a different star system. One of which turned out to be an infant. And Mac's job, his task, was to go and sort of insinuate himself into this family and shepherd this, what was now an infant, shepherd him through their lives, and at a proper time, they would take him or her to Prime to expose them to Prime technology and science, and that maybe that would be the prod for this person to finally discover how to go to a different star system. Well, how to do that? That's this kid obviously had a mother and father, and how does one not even from the same planet, how do they insinuate themselves into that family to be with them long term, years and years and years, 20 years, 30 years? How to do that? Well, that's a situation we find ourselves in right now. Well, this story, on a little bit different note, this story is kind of like the centerpiece of this whole thing. When I wrote it, I felt like that a lot of the story. There's 4 parts right now. There's a lot of the story is sort of riddled with porn. Not real bad porn. In fact, I enjoy a good story, and if it contains some less than desirable and mixed company material, well, that's okay, because I'm not going to, like I said before, I'm not going to give it away. I'm not going to show it to anybody. I'm not going to give it to any of my friends, blah, blah, blah. But this story turned out to be a part of the story that I could send to my aunt and various cousins and show them the story because it was just so interesting. Well, the timeline that Prime had seen is that this person actually was actively in search for the solution to this problem, but was not successful. Well, Mac wound up in Hawaii at a Prime installation on Earth plus 23. And once he got acclimated to the planet and some of the odd idiosyncrasies, he traveled to Kyoto, Japan. Well, his cover story was that he was wealthy, and for the foreseeable future, he would live here and there, sort of simply, and enjoy what there was to enjoy. Part of his quasi-retirement with a lot of money was that he felt like he should sort of get himself into the business community wherever he was and develop an actual reason for being. So it turned out there was a Japanese Prime agent already in Kyoto who, after Mac arrived in Kyoto, he arranged to buy this relatively expensive house out in one of the suburbs of Kyoto, and it was like a little kind of an enclave of about 200 houses, and it was just a delightful place. A lot of trees and a lot of bonsai trees sitting in little alcoves and shrubs everywhere, flowers everywhere. It's just a beautiful place. Very, very comfortable. Well, he had his agent get with some local artisans and populated the house with furniture of local manufacture. Big words, but live with it. Well, he had developed a sort of a routine that he would walk down to the local commuter train station and get a commuter train into Kyoto, go to work, and at the end of the day, he would go back to the train station, get on the commuter, and go home. And when he got to the local train station, he would walk to his home. He did this because he thought he wanted to be really kind of as normal in his life as he could be. Pretty much every time that he was out and about, he would say hello to these people, and a lot of them spoke English. And so he would say hi, hello, how are you? He'd never felt quite yet to invite them into his home for coffee or whatever, tea. And a lot of them were a little older than him. But at any rate, he thought it was a hindrance a little bit, but not that much. He thought he was making some progress. He noticed several times in the morning that cars would come into the enclave and pick the guys up and presumably would drive them into Kyoto, into their business. And he actually felt like he could afford that. But he decided to do the commuter train because it was an interesting thing for him. He'd never actually been involved with a culture like Japan. So that's what he did. He went to work on the commuter and walked to the train station. And it was all like that. And he thought that some of these guys that wound up having a car come and pick them up, that they probably ought to get out and walk to the train station themselves, to get humble themselves, so to speak. And he smacked himself in the side of the face and said, get real. This is the way these people live. Well, one day he was at work and had to go to the loo. And on the way to the bathroom, he went by a sort of a center floor break room. Here's this very good-looking young woman with an infant in arms, a young girl of about 6, with this older man who Mac recognized as one of a bank executive type persons for a bank on his floor. The older gentleman bent down and gave presumably his daughter a big hug and a kiss on the cheek, and then got down and picked up the 6-year-old girl, gave her a big hug, and kind of patted the infant on the top of the head. And it looked to Mac like it was like a little family group, like a daughter and her family would come into town and have lunch with her father and all that. Well, he went to the loo, and then he came back, and they were all gone. He actually, at that time, he had sort of come to the conclusion that he really didn't have enough business, any kind of work, actually, that would keep him busy all day long. So he decided that he would start today by taking off early and then going on home. There was no real social stuff going on around his office, so he says, "Oh, I might as well go on home." So he gathered his stuff up and he said goodbye to his agent, who had the next office over. Walked out to front of the building, and as he was walking down the street toward the train station, he saw ahead of him this woman with the infant in arms, and the excuse me, the young girl traipsing along, and they were making good time. They were. He was not able to get closer. They were just sort of moving out. He saw him go in the train station, and he just says, "Well, I'll never see those people again." So he got in the station, got his ticket, and the way things work with Japanese commuter trains is that those trains stop on a dime. They stop exactly where they're programmed to. Those drivers know exactly how to put it like within inches of where it should be. Well, each one of these cars has like 3 doors and a line on the platform that goes straight for one of those doors. And the way the train stops is like you will naturally kind of find out where it is you want to get off of the train when you get to your destination. Like have the exit stairs right there. Well, you kind of feel like you know where you belong in one of those lines, and you'll find 6 or 8 people or a dozen people or 1 or 2 lined up before the train gets there. The train comes in, and within about 10 or 15 seconds, everybody is off or on. Well, Mac headed for his line, and he stepped up behind at the tail end of the line, and he looked at the people directly in front of him. Here's this woman with the infant and the 6-year-old. The 6-year-old turned around and looked at him and did a double take and said something to her mother in Japanese. And she looked down and said something back. Youngster replied. She again looked at me. I could not look away. I blurted out, "Do you speak English?" I suppose at that moment I had a pained expression on my face, but tried to do a feeble smile. She smiled back and replied yes, and then pointed down to the infant, "But this one doesn't." I looked down at the 6-year-old, and she put on a crooked smirk and then shook her head that yes, she also spoke English. She then giggled like any small girl would do, making a funny. The woman then laughed as well. I just said, I can't believe what's happening. Well, I spoke to her, and I said that I had seen them in the office with an older man that afternoon and thought that I would like to meet that woman. And then you guys disappeared when I returned from the restroom. I thought it was like 2 ships passing in the night, and that I would never see them again, and that here you all are standing in line waiting for the train I normally get on too. I looked down at the 6-year-old who was absorbing all this, and like someone 10 years older piped up and said, yes, it was a miracle, all right. Her English was perfect. I thought maybe her teacher was somebody from the Midwest in the U.S. The youngster then moved to stand beside me and took my hand. In Japanese, she spoke to her mom. Her mom replied in English, "Sus, we can't do that." Then Sus replied to her mom, also in English, "Why not?" Her mom then looked at me and said that her name was Mitsuko. She said that Sus had suggested taking me home with him. She then shrugged and I thought was just giving me a chance to say that yes, that was silly and I had a family I was headed home to. I looked down at Sus and said that, yeah, maybe the gods are smiling down on us today. I turned to Mitsuko, said that I would at least walk him home from the station and swap phone numbers, and then I would just head home. I said that I was single and I lived alone, so I had no complications in my life that would preclude me doing that. I said that tomorrow is another day, and if anything was going to happen, it would. Otherwise, we go on our way. Sus said, little Sus. Sus said, "Sounds good to me," in perfect English. I told him that my name was Mac. Mitsuko looked down at Sus and back to me and said, "Kids." And she giggled like Sus. Our train arrived. We shuffled on and luckily found seats right away. I sat on the other side from Mitsuko and Sus. As the train started, Sus came over to me and inserted herself between my legs. My arms went around her and her hands grabbed my arms to hold on as the train moved rapidly along. Mitsuko had this astounded look on her face as she saw her daughter acting like I was a long-lost papa rather than a rank stranger. I asked Sus if she knew her stop. She turned her face to me and told me the name. I started, and I told Sus that that was my stop, too. I said to her, "Better and better." I said that I would probably not to have to go too far to get home after walking them home. Sus shook her head affirmatively and squeezed my hands. Mitsuko then spent the next few minutes singing quietly to the infant as the train sped along. Sus at times sang the song along with her mom. She turned to me and whispered that she knew all these songs, as her mom had sung them to her not so long ago. There were several people around us listening to Mitsuko sing. They all seemed to know the songs as well, and one older lady clapped silently as one song ended. Sus then said to me that her mom can really sing, can't she? I agreed, and I sat trying not to stare at her mom. From time to time, Mitsuko looked up from her baby's face and smiled at me as she sang. I thought this was a very special day for me and for all of us four. Our train seemed to make the trip in record time. Almost before we knew it, Mitsuko stood up. Sus pulled me to my feet, and we moved smartly out the exit of the train. Mitsuko turned to me on the platform and said that she would just lead us along. I said okay, and I asked if I could carry her baby bag. Well, she handed it over, and I found that it was at least 20 pounds. I don't know what she had in there. I'm sure that her strength allowed her to carry it easily, but I was also sure she liked that I had volunteered to carry it. Sus kept my hand in hers to make sure I didn't get lost. Mitsuko led out the door of the station and moved down the lane. I thought this looked familiar. It should, as I took this route home every day from the office. I decided to keep quiet and see where she led us. We arrived shortly in my neighborhood and entered the tree-lined quietness of stately houses, wide upward sweeping roof lines, well-tended shrubs, small dwarf trees everywhere. My neighborhood, and yet Mexico kept heading down the street toward my house. The next house on my right was mine. I was almost ready to speak when Sue said something to her mother. Mitsuko stopped and turned to her daughter. In English, she says, "What is it?" Sue then turned to me and pointed to the next house, mine, and said, "That is where you live." She then pointed down the street to a majestic house 3 doors down and said, "That is where we live." Mitsuko said, "Are you kidding me?" Seuss replied, "Nope, Mac lives here and we live over there. I saw him move in." Mitsuko turned to me and asked, "Really?" And I said, "Yup. This is my place as of about 3 months ago." I said that I thought that up until now we had just not spied each other because of my time in the office had only changed today, and that I got home several hours later than she and Seuss did, apparently. Mitsuko looked stricken. I thought she appeared to be on the edge of tears. She looked down at Sue, still holding my hand, and then back to me. Her eyes seemed to be looking at me for the first time. She looked at my eyes and the rest of my face, and then down to Seuss momentarily, and then back to me again. She then moved to me, and standing sideways to keep from squishing her baby, she put her arm around me. Seuss then put her arm around her mom from where she stood, and we had a momentary family hug. Mitsuko stepped back and said that if I didn't mind, she was going to take me home with her, and that she was going to introduce me to her mom. She said her dad would not be home until late, but the next time she visited her dad at his office, she would introduce us there. This was Tuesday, and she said she was going to meet him for lunch again on Thursday. I said, "Fine, let's do it." The 4 of us walked on down the street to their house and walked up to the front door, through a perfectly manicured entryway stuffed with green growing things, including bonsai trees and several alcoves. The space had several benches, and secluded by an encircling hedge at the street, a small barbecue that appeared to be equipped with a small adjoining kitchen covered by what appeared to be a permanent structure open to everything but the sky. A lovely space. We arrived at the front door, where Mitsuko, with key in hand, opened one of the 2 massive entry doors. She called out to her mother, who promptly appeared in a side door off the main entryway. She didn't say anything as she took in the tableau in front of her. She looked at Mitsuko and Seuss, and then became aware of me standing there with the baby bag over my shoulder. She turned back to Mitsuko and raised her left eyebrow. I thought it was choreographed. It was funny. Mitsuko then showed a side I had not seen in the past half hour plus. She spun this yarn and said that she had suddenly seen me step up behind Seuss and her in the line at the train station and thought from his looks that he might be suitable for a suitor for her, and she had just brought me home to meet her. Her mom then spoke in English, which was not as good as Seuss and Mitsuko's English, but passable at any rate. She simply asked, "Is he rich? Does he have a nice house?" Seuss then stepped over to her Grams and took her hand. She led her to the door and pulled her Grams into the doorway and said that he lives right over there, pointing to my place. Seuss then brought her Grams back into the foyer and brought her to a stop in front of me. Seuss asked me, "Are you rich?" I said that I had paid cash for the place across the street and that my agent in Kyoto had enough in his expense account to pay for 20 years of expenses. Grams then said that, well, that being the case, you're invited to dinner, and for me to come sit in the kitchen with him and get comfortable with a cup of coffee. I immediately said I could go for that, and then followed them down a long corridor where a very large family room and kitchen was located. It looked like it was well used, but it was very obviously expensive, as all the appliances were high-end. Grams said that I could call her Grams, and I in turn said she could call me Mac. The only surprise in this whole introduction process is that then Grams walked over to me and gave me a whole-body hug and held me for at least 30 seconds. She quietly told me that in order to keep Mitsuko from getting too jealous, that I should perhaps limit our hugs to once a day. She said that so that Mitsuko and Seuss could hear. The whole group then laughed out loud. Grams said that this is what comes from having a lot of money. The laughter continued. A few feet away from the kitchen was a large 6-person teak table with chairs to match with cushions on the seat in the back. It was well used. I asked Grams how old the table was. She told me that she really didn't know, but was very likely 200 years old. I was thinking it was very substantial and well built, but didn't think that old. As I looked closer, though, I could see there were no fasteners in sight. It was built from pieces which fitted together with locking pegs and wedges. The joints were barely visible. I loved it and said it was the best-looking table I had ever seen. I didn't want to go overboard in praising its obvious quality, because in some circles that would demand it be gifted. I stopped by even talking about it, but examined it closely every chance I got from then on. I sat at the table and Seuss climbed up into my lap. Mitsuko had gone away upstairs to get changed from her traveling clothes and to change the baby. Grams, Seuss, and I had a great chat. I found that Grams had spent some time in the U.S. as a student many years ago, and that explained her English capabilities and also her accent, as I thought it was from someplace in New England. I thought one day she would tell me some of her adventures there. She also said that her husband's name was Nobuyuki, but went by Nobu. She said for me to just start calling him Nobu when you meet him. Sue sat comfortably with me while her Grams and I talked. The coffee came and was delivered by a young girl who appeared to be the domestic help. She was introduced as simply Mary. I said hello, and she murmured hi. And that was the extent of that attempt at conversation. Seuss took note of how much coffee creamer I used and said that that ratio was what her mom used. She leaned back to me and twisted her face toward my ear and whispered that I was doing just fine and for me to not screw it all up. I laughed and Seuss giggled. Well, Mitsuko came back into the room and said that Mary had taken over the care of the little one. Mitsuko had on a simple flowing robe-like affair that came down to her ankles and basically obscured everything. I said to her that I liked her dress and left it at that. I have no idea what we had for supper that night, but filled to the gills, I finally had to excuse myself after thanking Grams and Mitsuko and Seuss for a very pleasant evening. We exchanged cell phone numbers and that I would be looking forward to seeing her at the office on Thursday with Seuss and the baby. Well, Mitsuko walked me to the door, where she wrapped me in a full hug and quietly whispered that she wanted me in her life. She said that she was perhaps hampered a little with her family, but she said that after some preparations, that she would come over and spend the night with me. This is, she said, if I had room for the baby and Seuss to come with her. I drew back from her and said that I had at least 5 fully furnished bedrooms for Seuss, and at least one room adjacent to my bedroom that will be perfect for a nursery. Mitsuko then looked again as if she was going to cry. She said quietly that she never expected to ever hear words to that effect again.